This episode is called Cold Case. On Sunday, September 18th, 1994, Jennifer Thompson went to the county fair for the fourth day in a row. Growing up in the tiny town of Orofino, Idaho, not much usually happened. So 14-year-old Jen wasn't about to waste the most exciting days of the year. Back on Thursday, Jen and her friends had gone on all the rides from the carousel to the Ferris wheel, and then on Friday they went to the county livestock auction, and Saturday was the parade, and now on Sunday they had already watched the log cutting competition, and as they had, they totally gorged themselves on every kind of food the fair had to offer. Corn dogs, funnel cakes, cotton candy, caramel apples, and also all the soda they could drink. Now it was time to go home, and Jen was feeling completely full, like she had just eaten an entire Thanksgiving dinner. Still though, she and her friends each bought one more corn dog for the road, before taking one last walk around the fairgrounds and saying their goodbyes. When Jen got home, her dad Dennis was on the phone, and her mom Sherry was busy making dinner. So Jen just went upstairs to her bedroom. She had a bunch of homework she needed to finish before school on Monday. Jen liked school sports a lot more than school work, but she was in 8th grade now, and she didn't want to fall behind. So she grabbed her math assignments out of her backpack and worked on equations until her mom called her for dinner. Jen made her way downstairs and sat down at the dining room table. Her mom had made one of Jen's favorite meals, chicken and rice casserole. But after all that junk food at the county fair, Jen really didn't have an appetite. So she mostly picked at her plate and told her parents all about her day at the fair, and about how sad she was that it was now over. After dinner, Jen's mom asked Jen if she wanted any dessert, and despite her very full belly, Jen said yes. And so before long, Jen was crushing a big bowl of vanilla ice cream, and then afterwards, she helped her parents clean up before she went back upstairs to her bedroom. Once there, she finished her homework, and then just went to bed early. She wanted to be well rested for school the next day. When Jen's alarm went off in the morning, she dragged herself out of bed and shuffled into the bathroom. But when she turned on the light, a sudden sharp pain shot through her stomach. She doubled over and grabbed the bathroom counter to keep from falling down. For a second, Jen felt like she was about to throw up, but she breathed through the pain, and slowly, the cramp sort of went away. Jen released her grip on the counter and straightened up again. She stood for a moment, afraid the pain might come back, but everything seemed okay. Jen told herself that most likely she had just eaten too much at the fair and she was still feeling it today, and so she just went back to getting ready for school. After brushing her teeth, Jen got dressed and slid the math homework from last night into her backpack. Then she zipped up the bag, slung it over one shoulder, and started going downstairs. But about halfway down the steps, another sharp shooting pain cut through Jen's abdomen, and this did not feel like any sort of normal bellyache she had ever had. It felt more like something was trying to tear its way out of her stomach. Jen dropped her backpack and kind of hunched forward, clutching at her stomach. The next thing Jen knew, her mom was at the foot of the stairs, looking up at her with a mixture of confusion and concern on her face. Jen barely had time to tell her mom that she was in pain and feeling sick, before suddenly a big wave of nausea hit her, and she had to run back upstairs to the bathroom, where she vomited and also had diarrhea. A few moments later, Jen's mom, who had gone upstairs as well, knocked softly on the bathroom door and asked Jen if she was okay. Jen called out no and said she felt absolutely horrible. She said something was definitely wrong with her stomach. Through the door, Jen's mother suggested that Jen stay home from school that day. Jen was relieved, but was too nauseous to reply. When Jen's father, Dennis, got home from working at a local car dealership that evening, he went straight upstairs to check on his daughter. Sherry had told him that Jen was having a lot of stomach pain, and both parents agreed that the 4 days of crushing sugar and fried foods at the county fair was very likely responsible for this pain. But when Dennis walked into Jen's bedroom, he was shocked by how miserable she looked. Her face was red and her hair was damp with sweat. Jen told him she'd been throwing up and having diarrhea all day. Her stomach ached when she was lying down, but it hurt even worse when she was standing up. And some of the cramps were so intense, Jen said they made her cry. Dennis brushed a strand of hair out of his daughter's face, then said he was going to get her a glass of water. When he went downstairs, Sherry was waiting in the kitchen, and she would tell him that the only thing Jen had been able to stomach all day was just a few bites of ice cream, and she had been running a low-grade fever for hours. Both parents were very concerned now, but they weren't quite sure what to do. They knew their daughter absolutely hated going to the doctor, and so they agreed that, maybe now was not quite the time to take her yet. For now, Dennis and Sherry decided they would just continue giving their daughter water and Tylenol and check on her throughout the evening. Eventually, despite all her discomfort, Jen would fall asleep, and after she did, Dennis went to bed hopeful that his daughter would feel better soon. 2 days later, on Wednesday morning, Dennis got out of bed and walked upstairs to his daughter's room. But when he went inside, Jen barely stirred. She'd hardly eaten anything for 2 days, but still her stomach cramps had only gotten more painful and more frequent, and she was still running a fever, she was still vomiting, and she was still having diarrhea. Dennis knelt next to his daughter's bed and shook her shoulder until she slowly blinked awake. Then he told his daughter he had bad news. She clearly was not improving, so he and her mother had decided it was time now to go to the doctor. Jen groaned, but she didn't put up a fight, and to Dennis, this was actually a bad sign. His daughter was clearly so sick that she wasn't even trying to avoid the doctor. Dennis helped Jen get out of her bed and let her hold onto his arm for stability as they made their way down the stairs and out to the car. Then Dennis backed out of the driveway and headed to their usual family medicine clinic. A few minutes later, Dennis helped Jen climb onto an exam table, and he could tell she was struggling just to sit upright. Before long, Jen's longtime pediatrician, Lyndon Bishop, came into the room, and he was surprised to see his athletic, young patient looking so ill. He listened closely as Dennis explained his daughter's symptoms, and all the while, Jen just silently sat there, clutching her stomach and leaning forward. Dennis told Dr. Bishop that he was pretty sure his daughter had food poisoning from something she must have eaten at the county fair. But when the doctor gave Jen a quick physical examination, he said that he thought Dennis was actually wrong, that this was something else. Because he said, food poisoning usually only lasts for 1 to 2 days, and Jen had been in pain for over 3 days. And so Dennis was taken aback by this, but he understood the logic. Dr. Bishop asked Jen if she had any history of stomach pain. Her father was about to answer for her, but then Jen lifted her head up and said yes in a weak voice. But that was all she could manage to say before she had to slump forward again. At this point, Dennis stepped in and he explained that not long ago, Jen had suffered from debilitating cramps in her lower abdomen for seemingly no obvious reason. Dennis and Sherry had taken their daughter to a gynecologist who found that one of Jen's ovaries was swollen to 3 times its normal size. Fortunately, this swelling was not cancerous, and eventually Jen's cramps had just kind of gone away on their own. Dennis admitted that, when Jen first got sick after the county fair, he didn't even think about her swollen ovary because her illness was so much worse this time. He didn't think a swollen ovary could give his daughter symptoms like a fever, diarrhea, and vomiting. But Dr. Bishop said he did think it was possible. Maybe Jen was ovulating, and that caused the swelling to return, and her symptoms came back even worse than before. It was the best and really only theory they had for now. So Jen was ultimately sent home with strict instructions to come back if the pain got any worse. Dennis was disappointed there wasn't more they could do for the moment, but he trusted Dr. Bishop's judgment, so he helped Jen off the exam table and walked her back out to the car. He leaned the passenger seat all the way back so Jen could lie down, and then as they drove home, Jen curled into the fetal position and began moaning. It made Dennis feel terrible to see his daughter suffer so badly when he really couldn't do anything to help her. But he reminded himself what Dr. Bishop had said right before they left. Don't worry, Jen will feel better soon. Later that evening, Dennis tucked his shivering daughter into bed. Sherry had gone out of town to visit the couple's other daughter. Dennis was going to be holding down the fort by himself along with Jen, and so far everything seemed to be okay. At least Jen was resting. Dennis put on his pajamas, brushed his teeth, and climbed into bed to watch TV, but as soon as he turned it on, he heard his daughter screaming, so he jumped out of bed and sprinted to Jen's room. When he got there, he found his daughter lying on the floor, curled up into a ball with tears streaming down her face. Jen kept screaming that she'd never felt anything that hurt this badly. She said she literally felt like she was going to die. In a total panic, Dennis ran back downstairs to the living room, he grabbed the phone and called the nearest emergency room. A receptionist answered and patched him through to a nurse, and Dennis explained what was happening, and the nurse paged Dr. Bishop, and he responded immediately, saying, "You know what? It sounds like Jen has appendicitis." The nurse told Dennis to bring his daughter to the emergency room immediately. In severe appendicitis cases, the appendix can burst open inside the body, causing complications and even death. And so if Jen had acute appendicitis, then she would need surgery to remove her appendix as soon as possible. By the time they made it to the hospital about 20 minutes later, Jen was barely coherent. Dennis lifted her out of the passenger seat and carried her into the emergency room. Under the bright fluorescent lights, he could see that his daughter's face was bright red and drenched in sweat. As soon as Dennis approached the check-in desk with his daughter in his arms, the receptionist called for the nurse who he'd spoken to on the phone. Within moments, the nurse and other members of the hospital staff loaded Jen onto a gurney, and Dennis followed as they wheeled his daughter into a nearby exam room. The nurse began taking Jen's vital signs and saw that she had a fever, she was severely dehydrated, and her pulse was distressingly high. The nurse began to explain to Dennis what his daughter's vital signs could mean, but then a short man wearing glasses and a white coat entered the room. He introduced himself as Dr. Maurice Mazer, and he'd already been briefed up on Jen's condition, so he went straight to her bedside and began examining her. He began to press lightly on the lower right-hand side of Jen's abdomen to check her appendix. The doctor's prodding seemed to wake Jen up, and she began to cry out in pain and tried to push the doctor away. Dr. Mazer said that it did look like Jen had appendicitis. This would explain her extreme abdominal pain, her fever, and her confusion. The doctor said the only treatment was an emergency operation to remove her appendix, like right now. But as Dr. Mazer reviewed Jen's medical charts, he told her father that something didn't look right to him. Jen's white blood cell count, her body's natural defense, was going down. The doctor said the number of those cells should be soaring right now as Jen's body fought off this appendicitis. Dr. Mazer said the drop could mean two things. Either her infection was getting better, which seemed very unlikely based on how sick Jen still appeared, or her appendicitis was getting so severe that it was overwhelming her natural defenses. And so Dr. Mazer told Dennis that bottom line, he believed Jen's appendix needed to be removed immediately. Otherwise, his daughter's life could be in danger. Dennis looked at Jen, who looked absolutely terrified. Tears filled her eyes as she said she didn't want to have surgery. But all Dennis could do was promise her that she would feel better when it was all over. And then he gave his daughter a gentle hug before the nurses took her away to be prepped for surgery. Jen's mother, Sherry, returned from visiting her other daughter just in time to find Dennis sitting in the hospital waiting room. The couple spent the next hour waiting on the edge of their seats until finally Dr. Mazer entered the waiting room and sat down beside them. Right away, the doctor said Jen's surgery had gone smoothly and she was okay, but then Dr. Mazer frowned. He explained that while Jen's appendix did show modest signs of infection, it wasn't nearly bad enough to cause the agony she had been going through. The parents were confused. Their daughter had been rushed into emergency surgery to remove her appendix, but now that that was done, it sounded like it might not have been necessary. But Dr. Mazer, who was sensing this in the parents, assured them that they'd actually done the right thing, because during the course of this operation, Dr. Mazer had discovered something very unsettling about Jen. Jen's whole intestinal tract looked red and inflamed, and Dr. Mazer didn't know why. And so, in short, because of this operation, it was discovered that Jen's appendix was not badly infected. However, the rest of her digestive system was. And so Dr. Mazer said he hoped Jen would feel better now that her appendix was out, but he just wasn't sure if that had really done anything to fix the issue. Dennis and Sherry turned to each other in amazement. Neither of them were comforted by the idea that Jen might or might not feel better. It sounded like she had a dangerous infection that the surgery hadn't really touched. But there was nothing they could do about that now, so Dennis grabbed a magazine off the waiting room table and began to read, doing his best to distract himself until he could see his daughter again. "1,200 miles away at that very moment, A different and yet eerily similar story was playing out in rural Minnesota. A young nurse named Callie Vins was working in a small local medical clinic, and it was totally packed. Normally, it was not her job to check patients in, but there were so many people crammed into the small waiting room that the receptionist needed Callie's help. Callie pushed her short dark hair out of her face, feeling totally overwhelmed. She was an experienced and highly capable nurse, but the past few days had really pushed her to her limit. Dozens of teenagers had come into the clinic with fevers, diarrhea, vomiting, and extreme stomach pains. One of the doctors who worked at this clinic thought the teenagers had the flu, but to Callie, that didn't make any sense. For starters, if this was the flu, then why were only teenagers getting sick? Why not their parents or younger siblings? And why didn't they have runny noses, coughs, or any of the other respiratory symptoms typically associated with the flu? Callie heard the bell above the front door ring as yet another nauseous teenager and their parents stepped inside. Looking around at the waiting room full of sick kids, Callie knew she needed to do something. Whatever was going on here, she did not believe their small clinic was equipped to handle it. Callie turned and told the receptionist that she'd be right back. Then Callie made her way through the crowd of people and into the back of the clinic. At the nurse's station, she pulled out the office phone book and found the number for the Minnesota Department of Health. As soon as a representative answered her call, Callie described the mysterious outbreak in her small rural town. The representative told Callie to collect saliva, urine, and stool samples from all the patients and send them in to the health department for testing. This way, state analysts could try to figure out what was causing this widespread illness. Callie thanked the official and then hung up the phone. As one of the clinic's doctors rushed past her on the way to visit yet another patient, Callie pulled them aside and explained what they needed to do. A couple days later, 14-year-old Jen Thompson was back at home in Orofino, Idaho, lying on the living room couch and watching TV. She'd been released from the hospital, but so far, recovering from her appendectomy had been very difficult. The incision on her lower abdomen was always itchy, her stomach ached constantly, and she could barely keep food down. Plus, on top of that, she'd never been so bored in her life. It had only been a little over a week since she got sick, but she already just felt so isolated. She missed going to softball practice and spending time with her friends. She even missed school, which was something she never thought she'd say. Jen picked up the TV remote and began flipping through the channels trying to find something she wanted to watch. But then suddenly, this sharp, totally overwhelming pain filled her stomach, and it was so intense it made her drop the remote. The pain she was having felt just like the cramps she had had before her surgery. Jen's bottom lip started to tremble. She called out for her dad, and a second later, Dennis rushed into the room. Jen was in so much pain she could barely breathe, let alone talk. But as soon as Dennis walked into the room, she really didn't have to explain anything to him. He could see clearly how much pain his daughter was in, and so a second later he had ran out of the room, got Jen's mother, and got the car keys, and then within minutes, the entire Thompson family was back on the road, heading to the hospital. Less than an hour later, Jen was lying on a hospital bed with Dr. Mazur standing over her. Dr. Mazur pressed lightly on Jen's abdomen and said her incision seemed to be healing fine. But clearly, something other than appendicitis was making her sick. Dr. Mazur said he was beginning to wonder if maybe Jen was suffering from an infection that was inside of her intestines. So he ordered a stool sample to be tested for a number of different bacteria. The idea of foreign bacteria inside her digestive tract really freaked Jen out, but it wasn't nearly as bad as what Dr. Mazur said next. Bacterial testing would likely take at least 24 hours to complete, and he didn't think they had any time to waste. Dr. Mazur was worried that he'd missed something along the way, so he suggested an exploratory surgery to see if he might be able to determine the source of her illness. Jen had already gone through one surgery, and the idea of being cut open again was almost too much for her to handle. She looked at her parents, wishing they could save her from this. Her mother looked like she was about to cry, while her father was just shaking his head back and forth. But Dennis told the doctor that if another surgery was what they had to do, then that's what they had to do. And deep down, even though Jen did not want to do this surgery, she knew he was right. So, despite Jen's deep anxieties, nurses began prepping her for the operation. They hooked her up to an IV and then cleaned the skin on her belly where the scalpel would cut her open. All the while, Jen felt like she was going to throw up. both from nerves and also from her illness. But just as the nurses were about to wheel Jen back into the operating room, Dr. Mazur came running into the room saying the surgery would not be necessary after all. The hospital lab was not very busy that day, so they'd been able to expedite the stool sample tests, and now he knew the source of Jen's illness. It would turn out Jen's illness was not from her enlarged ovary or from appendicitis. The doctor said she had a potentially deadly microorganism living inside her digestive tract. Now, it most likely came from something she ate, but the doctor said he had no idea what that could be. However, on the positive side, Dr. Mazur said that, while this microorganism was very dangerous, there was a very effective treatment that they could begin right away. As Jen's treatment began, 3 states away, a man named Larry Edmondson was standing in his office at the Minnesota Department of Health, staring at a large map that he'd taped up on his wall. It was a detailed picture of the state of Minnesota, and Larry had stuck a number of red thumbtacks into the map to mark different locations. Larry was leading the investigation into the mysterious disease outbreak in his state. After nurse Callie Vins had called the Minnesota Health Department, Larry and his team had received dozens of biological samples from patients at Callie's clinic. They tested each one, and they too discovered the source of the outbreak. It was the same microorganism that infected Jen in Idaho. But Larry didn't know about Jen. He thought the microorganism was only in Minnesota, and right now he was trying to figure out exactly where it came from. The Minnesota Health Department had continued receiving calls from medical clinics across the state, reporting patients with similar symptoms. Every time Larry got a call, he would send a representative to interview the sick patient and also to collect samples of anything they'd eaten recently. Then Larry put a red thumbtack on the patient's location on the map. He had hoped these red thumbtacks would be more concentrated in one particular area, allowing him to sort of pinpoint the origin of the disease outbreak. But the thumbtacks were spread out in a way that looked totally random. Larry didn't know what to make of this, but he knew that with each passing day, more people were getting sick. While Larry Edmondson puzzled over the Minnesota outbreak, representatives from the Idaho Health Department were digging through Jen Thompson's kitchen. As they did, Jen watched them from her spot on the living room couch. It had been just 1 day since Dr. Mazur diagnosed Jen, and she was already feeling much better. Dr. Mazur prescribed some antibiotics that were working well, and for the first time in over a week, Jen didn't feel nauseous. She could finally keep food down, but she was scared to eat anything that came from inside her house, because it might contain the deadly microorganism. Jen looked on as the employees pulled fruit, vegetables, cheeses, and meats out of the refrigerator. They took small samples of each item and sealed them inside of small labeled baggies. Jen heard them tell her parents that they would test the samples and let them know the results as soon as possible. Dennis and Sherry thanked them, and then the employees left. As soon as they were gone, Jen's dad walked into the kitchen and took all the food out of the fridge and out of the freezer and just dumped it into a trash bag, went into the backyard, and threw it away. When he came back inside, he told Jen they'd just go grocery shopping for new food tomorrow. That way they would know for sure that whatever they bought was safe to eat. At the Minnesota Health Department, Larry Edmondson had collected hundreds of food samples from the homes of people who had gotten sick. Now, microbiologists were hard at work testing those samples to determine which, if any, contained the deadly microorganism causing all the illness. Larry entered the lab to find 2 analysts staring down at a line of petri dishes. They looked up when they heard him come in, and he asked them for an update on their progress. And one of the analysts said that Larry's timing actually couldn't be any better, because they had just found something he needed to see. Larry immediately rushed over to them to see what they were talking about. He knew that each of these petri dishes contained a swab from the food samples that the health department had collected. The lab analysts were watching all of them for signs of this microorganism, and all of these samples currently looked normal, except for one, which had grown a whole bunch of small black circles all over the sample. Larry's eyes widened when he saw it, because those black circles were a telltale sign of this deadly microorganism. He asked the analysts which food that sample came from, and they said it was from ice cream. Larry quickly reviewed the records from his investigation, and the truth dawned on him. Every person who had fallen ill had recently eaten ice cream from a company called Schwann's. And now the health department had proof that this ice cream contained this deadly microorganism. Larry almost wanted to cheer, but he reminded himself that this was not really a time to celebrate. He was sure that the company, Schwann's, had no idea their ice cream was poisoning people, so Larry would have to call them right away. A few days later, Larry sat in his office at the Minnesota Health Department feeling very frustrated. This case just kept getting more difficult. When Larry had called the ice cream company, Schwann's, he learned something very concerning. Schwann's ice cream was not typically sold in grocery stores. Instead, it was delivered directly to customers' doors all across the United States. Now, Larry still knew nothing about 14-year-old Jen Thompson's severe illness out in Idaho, but he now understood that this disease outbreak likely went far beyond Minnesota. On the bright side, though, Schwann's had been extremely cooperative. As soon as they learned their ice cream was tainted, they shut down their factory and recalled all of the potentially contaminated products. Schwann's delivery drivers were going door to door across the nation, informing customers of this outbreak and collecting tainted ice cream. But the Minnesota Health Department still hadn't figured out how the microorganism got into the ice cream in the first place. And that was the only way to prevent this disaster from happening again. Larry read over a report from one of his colleagues. They had swabbed miles of stainless steel piping at the company's giant manufacturing plant, but none contained any trace of this microorganism that sickened all the teens. So where was it coming from? Minnesota officials had expanded their investigation to include the company's distribution system, and so Larry's coworkers were now analyzing the company's trucks, trying to see if maybe the product was contaminated during shipping. Just then, Larry's phone rang, and he picked it up, hoping it would be one of his colleagues with good news. But it wasn't. When Larry answered, he heard a man's nervous voice, and this man said he had a tip about the department's ongoing food safety investigation, but this man was calling from a payphone because he wanted to stay anonymous. When Larry heard this, he sat upright, pressing the phone hard against his ear. He told the man that was fine. Larry didn't need his name, he just needed whatever information he had. So the man whispered that he was a truck driver, and the company he worked for shipped two kinds of cargo: bulk ice cream for Schwann's and unpasteurized liquid eggs. The driver said that the same trucks could carry liquid eggs one day and ice cream the next. And then in between, the refrigerated cargo tanks on the back of the trucks were supposed to be thoroughly cleaned so that there was no contamination from one load to the next. But the tipster said one driver had not been given the right cleaning supplies to disinfect their vehicle after hauling thousands of gallons of liquid eggs. So bacteria from the unpasteurized eggs contaminated the entire truck. And so as soon as the Schwann's ice cream was loaded into that truck, the ice cream got contaminated. Larry thanked the driver for coming forward. Because of him, the Minnesota Health Department could finally close this case. Larry immediately went to his supervisors and told them the whole story. When that cargo truck wasn't cleaned properly, it turned into a giant incubator for a type of deadly bacteria found in unpasteurized eggs, called salmonella. The salmonella bacteria then mixed with a giant shipment of Schwann's vanilla ice cream. And so after 14-year-old Jen Thompson got home from the county fair on Sunday, February 18th, 1994, she did her math homework, she ate her dinner, then right before bed, she ate a bowl of the contaminated Schwann's vanilla ice cream. And so, of course, she and her parents had no idea that her dessert was full of salmonella bacteria. And so as a result, Jen just kept eating more and more of this contaminated ice cream each time she felt sick, because it was really the only food she could actually stomach. And so as this bacteria continued to multiply inside of her body, she got sicker and sicker. Jen and her family had no idea the ice cream was behind her illness until sometime in mid-October, when a Schwann's delivery driver came to their door and asked to take the contaminated ice cream back. The Schwann's salmonella contamination was one of the biggest mass poisonings in American history. In total, there were 593 confirmed cases of salmonella poisoning across 41 states and as many as 5,000 suspected cases nationwide. However, some experts estimate that there may have been nearly 225,000 people who got sick from this tainted ice cream. They just didn't report it. The ice cream company, Schwann's, paid out thousands of settlements to victims and changed their shipping procedure to make sure this contamination could never happen again. As for why the illness predominantly struck teenagers, it was likely due to two factors. One, young people tend to eat more ice cream, and two, young people tend to be more shy or embarrassed to talk about gastrointestinal issues than their more senior counterparts. And so as a result, maybe they began having symptoms and could have gone to the doctor and dealt with them, but in fear of being embarrassed, they didn't go to the doctor and let this condition get worse and worse and worse, and then finally it turned into a full-blown emergency room visit. But very few of the people who got salmonella poisoning had symptoms as severe as 14-year-old Jen Thompson. Even after having her appendix removed, she had to undergo at least 3 more surgeries to fix her damaged digestive system, including having her gallbladder taken out. The salmonella also caused her to develop a rare type of arthritis. To this day, Jen still lives with chronic pain, all because of a few bowls of ice cream she ate back in 1994. Which is a small, snowy town in British Columbia, Canada, used to be a place no one had heard of. Then Isaiah Otieno changed that. In 2006, an 18-year-old smiling young man named Isaiah Otieno stepped off of a plane in Cranbrook and began making his way toward the baggage claim. As he walked, everyone in the airport stopped and stared up at him. Isaiah was 6'9" tall, and he was from Kenya, making him easily one of the most unique people in all of Cranbrook. Isaiah, who was the son of a Kenyan politician, had worked really hard to earn his slot at the local university, called the College of the Rockies. His plan was to use that degree to get a great job so he could help support his family back in Nairobi. Not long after the first semester of Isaiah's freshman year had started, he was not only flourishing academically, but also socially. His big smile and his charm and his incredibly good manners had earned him many friends, as well as the nickname the Gentle Giant. But the person Isaiah most closely bonded with while he was in Cranbrook was another student named Isaac Hockley. Isaac, in addition to being a student at the College of the Rockies, was also a passionate photographer and actually worked part-time for the local newspaper as a freelance photographer. Isaac and Isaiah had briefly met in late 2006 at their campus's billiard halls when they were both playing pool, but that interaction had not made them friends. What had cemented their friendship and made them very, very close was one night in early 2007, Isaiah had gotten a job as a bouncer at a local bar because he's 6'9", and so he was the bouncer, and Isaac had come to that bar, not to see Isaiah, just to go to the bar, and so Isaiah's at the front, he's checking people in, and then he hears this commotion in the bar behind him, and he turns and he sees Isaac is getting attacked by this huge guy that's way stronger than him, who looked like he was the aggressor in the fight. And so without any hesitation, Isaiah turns and just starts galloping into the bar. He's leaping over chairs, he's leaping over tables, and he jumps into the fray, and he fought off Isaac's attacker. And so after the dust settled, Isaac was so thankful for Isaiah, even though Isaiah kind of downplayed it and acted like it was no big deal. But either way, the experience totally bonded these two very different people, and after that, they became totally inseparable. Over the next couple of semesters, the pair would often go off on long rides outside of Cranbrook into the mountains and the forests, and they would just chat. Isaiah would talk about what it was like to live in Kenya and how he was really here to try to be successful like his father. And Isaac would talk to Isaiah about his passion for photography and what it was like growing up in Canada around Cranbrook. On one very memorable drive, the pair were driving at night along this kind of winding road that went through a forest when all of a sudden a moose leapt onto the road and blocked their way. And so Isaac at the last second had to swerve to avoid the moose. But ultimately, they did not get into an accident and it was just a close call. So Isaac was totally fine. He had kind of recovered within seconds of getting past the moose. But Isaiah, who was in the passenger seat, was totally shaken up by it. And when Isaac started talking to Isaiah about why he was so shaken up, because after all, they are fine, they did not get into an accident, Isaiah would admit that he wasn't shaken up because they almost got into an accident. He was shaken up because he saw a moose. He didn't know moose existed, and so seeing this enormous creature suddenly in the middle of the road right in front of them just had totally spooked him. And so after this, Isaac loved to bring this story up as a way of kind of making fun of Isaiah for his fear of moose, but it was totally in a loving way, and Isaiah would always laugh right along with him. But despite how well everything was going in both Isaiah and Isaac's lives to that point, everything would come crashing down in 2008. On May 13th, 2008, so 2 years after Isaiah showed up in Canada, Isaac got a phone call from his employer, the local newspaper, who told him he needed to head into town to take some pictures of a crash that had just happened. A helicopter had been flying over Cranbrook conducting a power line survey when they had lost power and crashed. And all three people, the pilot and the two people in back who were actually doing the survey, they all died on impact. Isaac, like everybody else who heard about this, was totally shocked. One, because it was totally tragic and horrible, but two, because nothing ever happened in Cranbrook. So to have something so big like this happen right downtown was just unheard of. And so Isaac hopped in his car and he began making his way towards the crash site. And it didn't take long before he saw this massive ring of people right at the intersection between 10th and 14th Street. They were all on the sidewalk and up on buildings, and everyone's just looking in towards this massive mound of jagged metal that was on fire, and all this black smoke was coming off of it, and there's ambulances nearby and police, and the fire department was there, and they're trying to put out the flames, but they can't do it. And so Isaac parks his car and he rushes over to this ring of people and he works his way towards the front. He pulls out his camera and he began taking pictures, first of the wreckage and the fire, and then also of the police as they put tarps over the bodies. Little did Isaac know, these pictures he was taking were about to take on a whole new significance for him. Earlier that day, just before 1 p.m., Isaiah wrapped up his final class of the day, and after he was done, he remembered he had some letters in his backpack that he had been meaning to mail to his family back in Kenya. And so he decided on his way home, he would make a detour to the post office and he would mail those letters. And so he left the building where this final class was and he stepped out into the bright sunshine of that May day. He put his headphones on and then he began to walk. At about 1:05 p.m., he arrived at the post office and he went inside just long enough to put his letters in the mail slot, and then he headed back outside. 1 minute later, at 1:06 p.m., as he was crossing 10th Street, the helicopter above lost power and crashed directly on top of Isaiah. Within seconds, he and the three people on board the helicopter would all be dead. It's believed because Isaiah was listening to music on his headphones, he didn't even hear the helicopter as it was crashing down. He was just walking, and then he was dead. It was a total freak accident. It wasn't until later that day that Isaac would realize the pictures he had taken of this scene included pictures of his friend. Before we get into our next story, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, HelloFresh. Back when I was 18 years old, I discovered my favorite food. I would dump an entire sleeve of Oreo cookies into a bowl and slap a quarter gallon of milk on top of them. Back then, this nutrient-dense power breakfast gave me enough energy to get through another grueling day of playing video games while remaining unemployed in my mother's basement. But today, being a mid-30s guy, my body just doesn't respond the way it used to Oreo sleeve cereal. cereal. So in recent years, I've had to work really hard to reduce my Oreo sleeve cereal intake to where it only makes up a paltry 75% of my total diet. And what I do with that massive 25% of my diet is I fill it with tasty and healthy foods like you can get through HelloFresh. HelloFresh sends you amazing food right to your doorstep. However, the catch is the meals aren't made yet. You need to make the meals. But the recipes are so easy to follow and they perfectly pre-portion everything out when you get it. So it really is super easy. HelloFresh also has a huge menu, including vegetarian, pescatarian, fit and wholesome. So whatever your goals are, HelloFresh makes it easy to stick to them. They also have a really good spring menu that just came out that's getting rave reviews. So if you want to be like me and stop sucking down so much Oreo sleeve cereal, then you gotta sign up for HelloFresh today. To do that, go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen16 to get up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. Okay, back to the stories. On a warm summer night in 1998, a 7-year-old boy named Tyler Florian fell asleep watching TV on his living room couch. Tyler lived with his parents as well as his older brother, Will, who was 10 years old, in a modest 2-story home in a rural neighborhood in West Virginia. That night, Tyler's father, who normally tucked the boys in at night, was out for work. And so after Tyler fell asleep, it was his mother who gently woke him up and encouraged him to head upstairs to his room. And so Tyler, he gets off the couch and he's groggy and he makes his way over to the stairs. He climbs up the stairs and he turns right and heads down the hallway to his room. He goes into his bedroom, he climbs into his bed, and then he falls asleep. In order to understand what happens next, you need to have a good understanding of the layout of the second floor hallway. That hallway stretched from the front of the house all the way to the back of the house. And at either end of this hallway were doors that led outside of the house, and these doors had big windows on them. The front of the house, that door, if you walked out it, you'd be walking out onto a balcony that overlooked the front yard of the property. But if you walked out the back door of this second floor hallway, you would not be walking onto a balcony. You would not even be on the second floor. You'd be basically stepping into the backyard of the house. And the reason for this is because the house was built into a hill. And so the back half of the house is literally underground. It's in the hill. And so there is no door on the lower half of the house because there's just earth behind the door. And so it's that second floor doorway at the end of the hall that serves as kind of like the exit to the backyard of the house. So with that in mind, Tyler, he gets upstairs, he goes to his bedroom, which is towards the front half of this hallway, and he falls asleep. And then only about an hour after falling asleep, he wakes up to the sound of someone using the bathroom. Tyler's bedroom was positioned right across the hall from the bathroom, and his door was open. And so Tyler's laying on his bed, he opens his eyes, and he's looking through his open door at the bathroom. And the bathroom, the door is shut, but he can see there's light coming out from underneath the bottom of the door, so he knows someone's in there. And so Tyler's just laying there watching whoever is in there. He's assuming it's his brother, who has a habit of going to the bathroom in the middle of the night. And so he's just kind of watching, and then at some point he hears the flick of the light as it's turned off, and he sees the light disappear from inside of the bathroom. The door swings open, and sure enough, it's his brother who steps back into the hallway. His brother looks into Tyler's room, but doesn't attempt to interact with Tyler. Instead, Will just turns and walks back down the hallway towards his bedroom. And so as Tyler is listening to the sound of his brother's footsteps fade down the hallway, he closes his eyes again and prepares to go back to sleep. But as he's laying there with his eyes closed, he can tell that his brother has stopped short of his bedroom and has turned around and is now walking back up the hallway towards the bathroom and towards Tyler's room. And so Tyler opens his eyes again because he knows his brother is about to be right in front of his bedroom, and he's thinking, okay, maybe he forgot something in the bathroom. And so Tyler decides to just watch to see what his brother does. And so sure enough, Will walks all the way up until he's standing right in front of Tyler's open door. But instead of going into the bathroom, Will walks into Tyler's room. And right away, Tyler sits up and says, hey, what are you doing? What's going on? And his brother, he pauses for a second and he begins to say something that sounds like he saw something out there, but he's hesitant. He doesn't really know how he wants to frame the thing he wants to say. And so Tyler's like, come on, what are you doing? It's the middle of the night. What's going on? And finally, Will just blurts out, I keep seeing a man wearing stripes at the end of the hallway. And so Tyler, he hears this and he can't compute what he's being told. And so he just says, what? What are you talking about, Will? What did you see in the hallway? And Will would say again, I keep seeing a man wearing stripes at the end of the hallway. I've seen him a couple times in the last couple of days. I go to the bathroom, and then when I start walking back, I see him outside the back door in our backyard. And so Tyler is so scared because his brother does not sound like he's making a joke. His brother sounds like he's telling the truth. And just the fact that his brother can't quite find the words to describe what he saw made it seem even more real. And so Tyler, he gets out of bed and he says, Will, we gotta go tell Mom. But that required going into the hallway and going down the hall towards where apparently this man in stripes was to get to their mother's bedroom. And so Will, who initially was not that scared of this man in stripes he had seen, was now starting to get pretty panicked in seeing Tyler's reaction to this. And so Will tells Tyler, stay right there, stay in the room. And so Will, he kind of peeks back into the hallway and he looks all the way down, and there is no man in stripes anymore. There's no one in the hall. And so he tells Tyler, the coast is clear, and the two of them run down the hallway all the way right in front of that door that leads into the back of the property where the man in stripes was, and they turn left and they go into their parents' bedroom where just their mother was because their father was out of town. And so they charge in there, they wake their mom up, and they're talking over each other, trying to communicate to their mom that there was a ghost, that there was an intruder, that there was something bad happening around their house. And so finally their mom just tells them to be quiet, and she says, okay, boys, sit on the bed. I'm gonna go have a look around the house. And so the two boys do as they're told. They sit on the bed, and their mom leaves the bedroom. She goes into the hallway, and she looks immediately to her left where the man in stripes supposedly was, and she doesn't see anything. She just looks out into their backyard. There's nothing there. She looks down the other direction, out the front of the house, doesn't see anything. She walks all around the house. She goes outside. She looks everywhere, but she doesn't see anyone or anything. And so eventually she comes back inside the house. She goes up to the second floor. She goes back to her bedroom, and she tells her boys, look, you probably just spooked yourselves. There is no man in stripes. You're totally safe. You're totally fine. Just go back to bed. You probably just imagined whatever you saw. And so Will, who was the one who saw the man in stripes, was very quick to accept his mother's answer. It actually seemed like it was a relief to have somebody tell him that what you had seen wasn't real. And so he very happily went back to his bed and he fell asleep. But Tyler, who had not seen the man in stripes, but had a very intense reaction to hearing his brother describe it, could not accept his mother's answer. It just totally freaked him out because his brother was always joking around about stuff, but this did not feel like a joke. This felt very, very real. But over the course of the next couple of days, weeks, months, years, Will never claimed to see the man in stripes again, and so pretty quickly, Tyler forgot about it. Fast forward 11 years to 2009, so Tyler is now 18 years old, and he and his mom were out in the car running some errands. And as they're driving around, they were just chatting about all sorts of different things, and at some point, they began talking about one of their beloved family pets, a dog named Max that they had when Tyler was really young. And so as they're kind of swapping stories about all the goofy things that this dog did, Tyler's mom suddenly says, hey, Tyler, do you remember the time that I opened the front door to let the cops into the house, and Max came bounding into the house, and he went right into the kitchen and he ripped open all the food? And Tyler's looking at his mom like, wait, when did the cops come to our house? When did you open the door to let the cops come into our house? And as soon as Tyler said this to his mom looked at him as if she had just given away something she hadn't meant to. And then she kind of relaxed and said, you know what? I never got around to telling you. Now that I'm thinking about it, you and your brother were asleep and you didn't even know this happened. And then afterward, me and your father decided not to tell you guys because we didn't want to scare you. Back when you were about 7 years old and Will was about 10 years old, your dad was away at work and we were all asleep one night when suddenly I wake up to the sound of someone or something moving around outside of our house. And so I sit up in bed and I go into the hallway and I look left and I look out that door into our backyard and I see standing up against the glass this man with his hands pressed to the window looking into the house. And so Tyler's mom would tell him how she totally freaked out and she flipped on the lights and it scared this guy who ran off, and then she called the police, and then the police showed up, and that's when their dog Max came bounding inside and shredded the bag of food. And the police, they searched the property, but apparently they never found this guy. Tyler's mom would go on to tell him that the police warned her that her description of this man that was standing at their back door matched the description of a man who was wanted for murder who was on the loose in the area. Tyler was dumbfounded. He didn't remember this because obviously he had been asleep, because this is something he would have remembered. And so he had so many questions about this whole situation. But the first question he asked his mom was, well, what did he look like? And his mom said, well, he was tall, he had dark hair, he had blue jeans on, and oh, you know what? He had a striped shirt on. It would turn out, for a couple of days in the summer of 1998, this suspected murderer who was on the run from police had apparently been hiding out on Tyler's family's property, and in the middle of the night, for whatever reason, this suspected murderer would walk over to the back door of the second floor hallway, and he would put his face up to the glass and he would stare into their home. This was the man in stripes that Will claimed to have seen. He was real. Tyler, after making this connection, would follow up with his family members and he would do some digging of his own, but he was never able to figure out who the man in stripes was or what happened to him. In 2012, a 22-year-old woman named Simone was living in a small winemaking village called Rüdesheim am Rhein, which is located in southwestern Germany. This village is strikingly beautiful. It's full of quaint European homes, and there's lots of rolling green hills with vineyards as far as the eye can see, and the village sits right on the banks of the Rhine River. Simone had grown up in this picturesque village, and she had loved it, but this was going to be her last summer before she left and headed off to New York City to start the next chapter of her life. And while she was excited about that, she was also kind of sad because this village and everybody inside of it were the only things she had ever known. And so the idea of leaving them behind just seemed very strange to her. But instead of focusing on the kind of growing anxiety around her imminent departure from Germany, she focused on what she would be doing that summer while she was still in Germany. Some of Simone's fondest memories of her childhood were of her time spent at summer camp. And this summer camp was located in this forest that was not far from her village. And every summer in July, Simone, along with about 200 other kids from her village and from neighboring villages, would converge on the campgrounds in the forest for 2 weeks of playing games and going on scavenger hunts and putting on stage plays and just generally having a really good time. But when Simone became a teenager and was too old to be a camp attendee, she decided she would volunteer and be a camp counselor. And she found it was awesome. She immediately connected with the other camp counselors and she felt all grown up, having a real job, and she loved goofing around with all of the kids. And so every summer since that first time volunteering, Simone had gone back and volunteered again. And this summer was no different. So in mid-July of that year, Simone packed up her things and she headed off to the forest. The way this camp worked was the 200 plus kids that were attending the camp, they would get dropped off in the mornings each day by their parents and they'd play and run around all day. And then in the late afternoon, their parents would come back and pick them up. So none of the kids were sleeping over at the camp during these 2 weeks. However, the 30 plus counselors, they would just stay at the camp for the full 2 weeks. They would just sleep in tents out in the forest. Technically, the reason they did this was to make sure they had enough time in the morning to prep the campgrounds for the kids, and then also in the evenings to have enough time to clean up and kind of have it ready for the next day. But in reality, Simone and the other counselors all knew that the camping out in the forest was the best part of the volunteer experience. After all the kids went home for the night, all of the counselors would finish up all of their duties and then rush off into the forest where their tents were and where there was a fire pit, and they would have some beers and wine because the legal drinking age in Germany is actually 16. So all these counselors are having a couple of drinks, and then before long they'd be laughing and telling stories and just generally having a great time. So that July in 2012, Simone and the other counselors arrived at the campgrounds a day early, and they caught up with each other and they prepared the campground. And then the next morning, all the kids showed up and everything went off without a hitch. And then that afternoon, after all the kids had been picked up by their parents, Simone and the other counselors rushed to finish up all their duties and then headed off into the woods to enjoy their first night hanging out together. After a couple of beers had been passed around the campfire, everybody was in good spirits and laughing and telling stories. But pretty quickly, people started to fade and get tired because, it was their first day back at camp and it had been a long, tiring day. And so people very gradually began retiring to their tents to go to bed. And eventually Simone, too, had crawled into her tent and gotten onto her cot to try to sleep herself. But she found that night it was so hot she couldn't be in her tent. It was stifling inside of there. And so she decides she's just going to sleep out in the open where it's a little bit cooler. And so she picks up her fold-up cot and she brings it out into the open, and she sees there are several other counselors who have done the same thing. And so she puts her cot down next to one of her good friends who's already asleep in her cot. And then Simone climbs into her cot, she gets under her covers, and she tries to fall asleep. But for the next hour, Simone just tosses and turns, she can't get comfortable, and by that time, everybody else has completely passed out. So it's just her, she's counting down the time until she has to get up again to start the next day, and so she's getting stressed about that. But eventually, she would fall asleep. However, she would immediately be thrust into one of the most visceral and intense nightmares she had ever had in her entire life. In her dream, she opens her eyes and she looks out in front of her, and it's this desert city, and there are hundreds of people all in front of her, just standing there looking up at her. And then she notices on her left and on her right are these two men, these big, huge men that are both working on something behind her. She doesn't really know what it is, but they're obviously busy doing something. And she kind of glances up at one of them and she notices he's holding something that looks like a wreath, like a holiday wreath you would hang on your door. And so Simone looks away from the guy with the wreath and just looks back out at this huge sea of people, which is totally bizarre because no one's moving, no one's making any sound, they're just staring at her. And then she feels this shooting pain in the top of her head. The man who was standing on her right was not holding a holiday wreath. He was holding a crown of thorns, and now he, along with the guy on the other side of her, were working together to press this crown of thorns into her head. And so Simone is feeling the thorns being pressed deeper and deeper into her scalp, and she tries to fight them off, but she realizes she can't move. She can't even turn her head to look at them. She can only see them out of her periphery vision. And then she tries to scream out for help to someone in the crowd to come help her, but when she opens her mouth, no sound comes out. And so as she's sitting there, all she can do is stare straight out ahead of her as the pressure of these thorns are driven deeper and deeper into her skin. And then at some point, blood begins dripping down in front of her eyes. And around that point, the pain became so blinding, so awful that it woke her up. And as soon as she woke up, she shot up and she reached for her head to make sure there was no crown of thorns on her. And as she's doing that, she's thinking, okay, phew, it was just a dream. That was just a horrible dream. I'm in this forest. I'm good. I'm safe. And as she's kind of patting on her head, she's realizing her head is wet. And as she's touching her head, she's realizing it hurts. There's a stinging pain in her head. And then she realizes it's not just a stinging pain, it's a throbbing, intense pain all over her head. And so as she's kind of having this realization that her dream is now kind of segued into her real life, she looks out ahead of her and she sees off in the distance in the tree line, something is running through the woods. She can't tell who or what it is, but she makes a mental note that there is someone running away from them. But this pain in her head has gotten so intense that she can't focus on anything else. She can only focus on the pain. And as she's thinking about how much her head hurts, she screams in pain. And the girl who was laying next to her that had been asleep, she wakes up to the sound of the scream, but it's totally pitch black. She has no idea what's going on with Simone. And so this girl, she sits up and she's trying to get Simone to tell her what's going on, but Simone has no idea. She's totally frantic. She can't really make sense of what's happening. And so this friend, she reaches down and she picks up a flashlight, she turns it on, and she aims the light at Simone, illuminating her head. And when this friend sees Simone's head, she starts to scream. Seconds later, the rest of the counselors that had been sleeping out were awake, and they were rushing Simone, who was now shaking and vomiting, over to one of the staff vans. And then 15 minutes later, they had driven her to the emergency room. It would turn out, after Simone had finally fallen asleep and she began having that really intense dream about a crown of thorns being dug into her scalp, Well, in reality, something was digging into her scalp, and it was kind of manifesting itself in her dream. And what was digging into her scalp was the jaws of a fox. This fox had snuck into the campsite and walked right up behind Simone and just started eating her head. And amazingly, it did not wake Simone up right away. And so this fox got 20 or so serious bites out of Simone's head before she shot up and scared it away. And so almost certainly what Simone saw running away from her in that quick moment was the fox. Doctors were able to save Simone and stitch her head back together, and they were even able to hide all of the scars in her hairline so you can't even see them. But despite her being physically okay today, psychologically, this was a very traumatizing event. Not only does she refuse now to go into any forest, whether it's day or night, but she also periodically still gets phantom pains in her scalp that feels like the fox is biting her head all over again. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, just before the apocalypse starts, remove all the labels off the follow button's canned goods and unplug their doomsday shelter. This episode is called Hard Case to Crack. 18-year-old Aaron Blocker shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It was January 2011, and the Mississippi College freshman was doing his best to pay attention in his chemistry class. Chemistry was usually Aaron's favorite class. He dreamed of being a scientist himself. But today, he was distracted. His stomach was cramping, and he really had to go to the bathroom. Aaron had Crohn's disease, an illness that causes stomach cramps, severe weight loss, and diarrhea. He'd been diagnosed the year before, but for the past few weeks, he'd been suffering from a prolonged flare-up. Already this morning, Aaron had left the lecture hall 3 times to go to the restroom. Aaron tried to ignore all the twisting and churning that was going on in his stomach and just listen to the lecture, but pretty soon, Aaron realized he couldn't ignore it any longer. So, like he already had 3 other times so far this morning, he quietly got up and began heading for the door again. But as Aaron climbed the stairs that led out of the lecture hall, he tripped over a backpack and nearly fell. Now, immediately, Aaron heard people laughing at him in the classroom, but that didn't really bother him, because all Aaron was thinking is, thank goodness that was not worse. Aaron had always been a bit uncoordinated, and he did fall kind of a lot, and unfortunately, he was very prone to breaking bones from even the mildest of impacts. As a child, he had managed to break his nose, his fingers, and his wrist, and he had also dislocated several joints. Thankfully though, on this day, Aaron did reach the doors of the lecture hall in one piece, and then once Aaron was out the doors, he hustled his way down the hall towards the bathroom. 2 nights later, Aaron sat in the college cafeteria across from his girlfriend, Emily, who he had been dating for nearly a year. Aaron was a grade ahead of Emily, so she was actually still in high school. She was a senior. But his college was not far from her home, and so she came to visit him whenever she could. Emily had just gotten her first tattoo, and she was telling Aaron all about the experience, but Aaron was having a really hard time focusing on her story. The distinctive sort of greasy aroma of sloppy joes and tater tots filled the busy dining hall, and it was making Aaron feel really nauseous. He was on a restrictive diet because of his Crohn's disease, and the cafeteria's very greasy food was brutal on his stomach. But his dorm didn't have a kitchen, so he really had no other choice but to try to eat as much as he could handle. As he tried to force down some food, his stomach suddenly spasmed and Aaron clutched his belly in pain. Emily saw this and stopped her story and asked if he was okay, but Aaron sort of brushed it off. He said he was used to the pain and told her not to worry. But this time, the pain was just too much, and Aaron doubled over in agony as another spasm cut through his gut. Emily shot up from her chair and put her arm around him, and then whispered to him that he really needed to go see a doctor. And Aaron nodded and told her that, his abdominal pains had been getting worse and worse for days. And so Emily gathered up all their things and then called a taxi to take them to the nearest hospital. A couple of hours later, Aaron laid in a hospital bed in the emergency room with Emily sitting by his side. The doctor had ordered an immediate CT scan of Aaron's abdomen, and so now they were just waiting for the results. Aaron clutched Emily's hand and let out a deep breath. He was, unfortunately, quite used to hospitals, doctors, needles, and machines. And in virtue of being Aaron's girlfriend, Emily, too, was very accustomed to this environment. Aaron was very grateful to have his girlfriend by his side. And so he looked up at Emily, and he told her he just could not imagine going through all this stuff by himself. But before she could reply, the ER doctor came into the room with Aaron's test results. And the doctor got straight to the point and said he'd found something very troubling in Aaron's CT scan. But it was actually not Aaron's gut that was concerning the doctor. He said during the CT scan, as they're trying to photograph his abdomen, the scan had kind of inadvertently caught a bit of Aaron's hip bones. And basically, the bones showed signs that they were dying. It's a condition called avascular necrosis, which happens when blood supply to a bone is cut off, and so the tissue decays. Aaron closed his eyes and grimaced. He wondered if maybe this condition he'd never even heard of might explain his history of so many broken bones. Aaron quickly filled the doctor in about his medical history and how doctors had really struggled to figure out why his bones always seemed so brittle. Throughout his childhood and teenage years, Aaron had been tested for various conditions, from common issues like arthritis to a rare genetic condition called Wilson's disease. But each time, the results were either negative or inconclusive. It wasn't until Aaron was diagnosed with Crohn's disease a year ago that Aaron finally got an answer that sort of made sense. His doctor had told him that because his Crohn's disease had been untreated for so long, Aaron had been malnourished, and as a result, his bones were weakened. But that was a year ago, and since then, Aaron had done everything in his power to eat right and build up his strength, and so it just seemed like, he would have been doing better by now. The ER doctor listened closely and took a bunch of notes. Then, after Aaron was done speaking, the doctor asked him if he was taking any new medications. And Aaron nodded and said that yes, for the past 8 weeks, he'd been taking low doses of a steroid called prednisone to help reduce the inflammation caused by Crohn's disease. Aaron could see from the ER doctor's expression that he was puzzled. The doctor said that steroids could cause bone damage like this, but only with prolonged use and high doses. In his opinion, 8 weeks was just not enough time to cause this much damage to Aaron's hips. But just to be safe, the ER doctor recommended that Aaron go see the other doctor who'd prescribed him this steroid to see if maybe they could change his treatment plan. Aaron's mind was swirling. He had convinced himself that if he could just get his Crohn's disease under control, he could live a normal college student life. But now here he was being told he had an even bigger problem with no clear solution. And so Aaron shook his head in disbelief. But at the same time, he tried to stay positive. He hoped that if he stopped taking steroids, his bones would stop breaking down and he would get better. 2 years later, on a muggy summer day, Aaron clutched the sticky vinyl seat of a campus shuttle bus. Every time the bus hit even the smallest of bumps, Aaron would feel pain shooting through his hips. Aaron was now 20 years old and working hard towards his degree in biology and medical sciences. It was fascinating to him to learn how the human body worked. He hoped that someday he'd know enough to understand what was happening to him. Because Aaron was still in constant pain. His weakened hips made it really hard for him to walk around campus, so he took the shuttle bus as often as he could, even though it was quite painful. Right after visiting the emergency room 2 years earlier, Aaron had stopped taking steroids, but that hadn't helped, and his hips had only gotten worse. At this rate, Aaron knew he could be facing a hip replacement surgery before he even turned 30 years old. When the shuttle bus came to a stop, Aaron carefully climbed down the steps and limped into the lobby of the school's medical building for an appointment with his orthopedist. He sighed as he shuffled his way into the very familiar waiting room. Doctors and nurses and hospitals were now as much a part of Aaron's life as college professors. A few minutes later, Aaron hobbled into an exam room and climbed up onto the crisp white paper covering the examination table. When the doctor arrived, he asked Aaron to lie down, but Aaron was in so much pain, the doctor had to actually help him lie down. After poking and prodding Aaron and also guiding Aaron's legs through several movements to check his range of motion, the doctor stepped back and grabbed Aaron's latest scans and began looking them over. and as he did, Aaron could tell he was very likely about to hear some bad news. He had seen that same concerned look on many doctors' faces in the past. Finally, the orthopedist lowered the paperwork and told Aaron that his avascular necrosis in his hip bones had continued to worsen and it was leaving behind a lot of dead bone tissue. And so he wanted Aaron to consider a surgery called core decompression to remove the diseased bone in Aaron's hips. Once the dead bone was gone, new blood vessels could develop and healthy bone could grow back. Ideally, this procedure would reduce Aaron's pain and help him avoid total hip replacement surgery down the road. Aaron was so desperate to feel better that he only had one question. How soon could they schedule this surgery? 8 weeks later, Aaron was at home in his small off-campus apartment, studying in bed. He hadn't been able to move much since his surgery, and he was irritable at how slow his recovery had been. He was having trouble focusing on the biology textbook he was reading, so he put it down and reached for the TV remote. But when he clicked the power button, the TV wouldn't turn on. Aaron wondered if maybe the remote's batteries were dead, so he carefully swung his legs over the side of the bed, grabbed onto his headboard, and pulled himself upright. Then Aaron grabbed the aluminum walker right next to his bed that he needed just to get around, and he inched his way across the room to his desk. He pulled 2 AA batteries out of the desk, but then he dropped one of the batteries as well as the back of the TV remote onto the floor. And Aaron suddenly thought to himself, what is he going to do? Getting down on the floor on his hands and knees was just totally out of the question. It would not only be very painful, but he also might not be able to stand up again. And so Aaron just suddenly felt overwhelmed by how much pain he was in, how inconvenient his life now was, and also just the fact that 2 months after surgery, it just did not feel like he was getting any better. But just then, Aaron heard the key in the front door, and a moment later, his girlfriend Emily called out his name. Aaron was so relieved that she was there. He yelled that he was in his bedroom and he could really use some help. Emily came into the room and she could see that Aaron was very distraught. She helped him back into his bed and then reached under the dresser to retrieve the battery and the back of the remote. Emily suggested that Aaron just close his eyes for a half hour and she'd make him some lunch. Aaron smiled and felt so thankful to have Emily in his life, and then he did close his eyes. But Aaron was too anxious about his situation to fall asleep. It felt like his life's goals were slipping away from him. Aaron had had to take time off of school after the surgery, and he didn't want to delay getting his degree any longer. And so he really just had to find a way to get better soon, or else the future that he longed for with Emily just wouldn't be able to exist. One month later, a nurse at the orthopedist's office led Aaron into an exam room and closed the door behind them. Aaron attempted to climb the tiny step stool in front of the examination table like he had done so many times in the past, but this time the pain in his hips was so extreme he just couldn't do it, so he opted for a chair instead. A minute later, Aaron heard a soft knock on the door and his orthopedist came in. The doctor pulled up a stool in front of the room's computer monitor so they could look at the results of Aaron's latest CT scans. Once the doctor had pulled up the images, he pointed to the balls in both of Aaron's hip sockets, and then he pulled up another image of a healthy hip joint to compare. The doctor said that on the healthy hip, the ball and socket looked like a smooth round sphere surrounded by space. But on Aaron's hips, the balls looked broken down and fractured. The joints were surrounded by white shadows that represented scar tissue that had grown and grown over the years. This was obviously not what the doctor or Aaron had hoped for. The bones in his hips were grinding together and continuing to break down, which meant the core decompression surgery was a failure. Aaron asked the doctor why his bones kept decaying no matter what doctors recommended, and the doctor admitted he simply didn't know. The doctor said the next step would be a double hip replacement surgery. But he assured Aaron that although it was unusual to replace hips in someone so young as Aaron, it was a common surgery with great results. And so he told Aaron that after his surgery, he would very likely be able to walk easily again and his pain would be gone. But despite that, this was still a very difficult decision for Aaron. If he went through with the hip replacement surgery, he would need up to a year of recovery and rehab. which would mean putting his schoolwork on hold again when he was so looking forward to graduation and doing scientific or biomedical research in the real world. And so this was going to be a really challenging decision. But then Aaron stood up to go get his jacket, and his hips hurt so much just walking the 3 feet to the coat hanger, Aaron realized he really had no choice here. The pain was so bad and it was only getting worse, and so he basically had to do the hip replacement surgery. 4 years later, in 2016, the clock radio on Aaron's nightstand belted out a pop song, jolting him awake. Aaron rolled over and hit the snooze button, and as he did, he smiled. Before his hip replacement 4 years ago, rolling over would have been so painful, but now he was moving just fine. It had taken a long time to become this healthy again. Following the hip replacement surgery, Aaron had to stop going in person to school and take online classes in order to finish his degree on time. He spent his time mostly indoors and bedridden, but slowly he had regained his mobility and had gotten his life back on track. Aaron had graduated from college and was now pursuing a master's degree in biomedical research at Mississippi College. At the age of 24, 4 years after the surgeries, Aaron was finally focusing on his future rather than his pain. Through it all, Emily had stayed by his side, like always. And at the end of 2012, Aaron asked her to marry him, and to his delight, she had said yes. They were married on August 1st, 2013, the best day of Aaron's life. Aaron could hear Emily in the kitchen cooking up some breakfast. A moment later, she called to him and asked if he wanted some eggs. Aaron yelled back that he'd be right there as he put his slippers on. Just then, Aaron's alarm clock went off again, and without thinking, Aaron twisted around to stop it. And as he did, he suddenly felt an excruciating pain in his left hip. The worst pain he had ever felt in his entire life. Aaron instantly writhed in pain and fell back on the bed and shouted for Emily. She rushed into the bedroom and tried to help Aaron stand, but he couldn't move his left leg at all because the pain was now totally unbearable. And so through gritted teeth, he asked Emily to hand him his phone, and when she did, Aaron called a friend, and a few minutes later, that friend arrived, and together with Emily, they helped lift Aaron up and carried him out to the car so they could drive him to the hospital. An hour later, Aaron lay on a gurney staring up at the hospital ceiling lights flashing past him as the ER staff whisked him down a hospital corridor to the CT scan room. Aaron had hoped that these emergency visits were behind him, but here he was again amidst the smell of disinfectant, the high-pitched sounds of equipment, and very sick people just like him. In the scan room, technicians helped move Aaron's aching body to the motorized table, making Aaron groan every time they touched him. As the table began to move, Aaron could hear buzzing and whirring noises as the machinery took images of his hips and midsection. Even lying there was painful, because Aaron had to clench his muscles to keep his legs perfectly still. Once the scan was over, Aaron clenched his teeth in pain as the technicians shifted him back onto the gurney and then wheeled him back to a waiting room. And after an agonizing hour of waiting, a doctor finally came in the room to go over the results. As the ER doctor pulled up Aaron's files on the room's computer, Aaron filled him in on his history with Crohn's disease, a vascular necrosis, and hip replacements. Aaron was so accustomed to recounting his medical history that it now came out like a well-rehearsed presentation. The doctor turned the computer monitor towards Aaron and told him that based on the scan, his hip implant had popped out of the socket and shifted into the wrong place. So the dislocated hip would have to be adjusted manually, a procedure the doctor warned would hurt, but only for a moment. The doctor asked Aaron if he was ready for the adjustment, and Aaron just sort of nodded and said okay. Then a second doctor came in to help with the procedure. Together, these doctors all around the bed forcefully pushed Aaron's hip back into place. And true to their word, it was a split second of agonizing pain, but it quickly dissipated, and Aaron felt much better. He asked the doctor what was next, and he got a familiar answer. Go back to your orthopedic surgeon for a follow-up. Several days later, Aaron sat inside the usual exam room at his orthopedist's office. The doctor examined Aaron's CT scans in silence for a minute, and then finally he spoke, and Aaron felt his heart sink. The doctor said that even though they had successfully popped the hip back into place, that didn't solve the underlying problem. Aaron's left hip implant had become loose because the bone around it was still decaying, and it was now only a matter of time until the same thing happened with his other leg. As a result, his hip implants were now too small to properly fit inside of their sockets. Aaron was shocked. How could this have happened? He'd followed all his doctor's instructions for years throughout his multiple recoveries and rehabs. He was very careful with his hips and he stayed away from really strenuous activities. And yet, he'd still dislocated his hip just from getting out of bed. It felt like all the progress he'd made was kind of for nothing. Aaron wondered what he could even do at this point to ease his pain. The orthopedic surgeon told Aaron that he couldn't really explain why Aaron's hips were in such bad shape, but he could tell him what should be done to respond. The only remedy he could suggest for now was to remove the damaged old implants and replace them again with larger ones. Aaron left the doctor's office in silence and headed for the parking lot. Then, alone, inside of his car, Aaron burst into tears. He just didn't know how much longer he could keep going like this. By the time Aaron got home, his despair had morphed into anger. He had already endured 11 serious surgeries and more broken bones than he could count, and he was only 24 years old. He'd seen a parade of doctors, and none of them had come remotely close to figuring out what was actually wrong with him. Even if he got another hip replacement, Aaron knew it was only a matter of time until he would have to do it again and again and again if his bones continued to decay. Aaron wondered if maybe he would just spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Just then, Emily got home from work, and when Aaron saw her, he went from being mad back to being sad all over again, and he broke down and just started crying. Emily tried to comfort him, but Aaron was inconsolable. So Emily just kind of let Aaron vent, and then once he was done crying and kind of talking about what was going on, she asked him to come keep her company in the kitchen while she made them dinner. Aaron smiled at her and then slowly eased himself into a chair at the kitchen table while Emily poured them each some wine. A few minutes later, Aaron had calmed down and he was thinking clearly, and he told Emily that too many elements of his medical story just didn't add up. Why would his hip implants fail after 4 years when they were supposed to last 20 years? Why didn't any of the other surgeries work? What was actually going on with his bones? If he was going to subject himself to yet another hip surgery, Aaron wanted to make sure he'd exhausted all other options first. But at this point, Aaron didn't trust any doctor to figure it out for him. So if he was going to find a solution, he felt like he would need to do it himself. Several weeks later, Aaron sat in bed with his laptop resting on his lap. Next to him, Emily was quietly reading a book. Aaron had compiled just about all of his medical records dating back to when he was a child, and finally, thanks to his years of studies, he could actually understand what they all meant. When he looked at all of his records together, Aaron found patterns that did make sense for a person suffering from Crohn's disease. But so far, nothing he was seeing could explain his weakened bones. Then, all of a sudden, Aaron sat up straight with a huge smile on his face. Emily noticed and put her book down and asked what was going on. And he showed her a series of his medical records going back a decade, all indicating severely low levels of an enzyme he'd only heard of once before called alkaline phosphatase. Back in 2010, when Aaron was a junior in high school, one of his doctors had noticed he had low levels of this enzyme, which was why Aaron had been tested for the genetic condition called Wilson's disease. Now, Aaron did not think much of this at the time, since the results were inconclusive, and no one had ever mentioned the enzyme again. But as Aaron dove deeper into his medical records, he noticed the low levels of the enzyme in 2011 as well, and 2012, and 2013. In fact, every year since 2010, his blood tests indicated low levels of alkaline phosphatase. Emily and Aaron looked at each other. What was this enzyme, and what did having low levels of it mean? They wondered if maybe it was the key to understanding what was going wrong with Aaron's body. Emily looked on hopefully as Aaron typed in, "What is alkaline phosphatase?" into an online search engine. The first result he got back was for a website dedicated to an ultra-rare disease with a long name Aaron had never heard of. Aaron clicked on it, and then immediately after reading just a couple of sentences, he looked at Emily with a big smile on his face. All of his symptoms matched up with what he was reading. Aaron had no doubt he had just found what he was looking for. A week later, Aaron sat across from his doctor, studying his face as the physician read over the printed out pages Aaron had brought for him. The doctor was unfamiliar with this very rare disease that Aaron had found online, but he agreed that it did make a lot of sense, and it could be directly caused by the low levels of alkaline phosphatase in his blood. Aaron suspected he had a condition called hypophosphatasia. It's an ultra-rare metabolic bone disease that affects the body's ability to make alkaline phosphatase, which helps bones stay healthy by absorbing essential minerals like calcium, phosphate, and magnesium. When there's a deficiency in alkaline phosphatase, the minerals don't get absorbed by the bone. Instead, these minerals collect on tendons, kidneys, and other organs and cause serious damage. In Aaron's case, they had collected on his hip bones. Aaron's doctor ordered immediate bone scans to test for hypophosphatasia, and a few days later, the bone scans confirmed Aaron's theory was right. Miraculously, Aaron solved his own lifelong health crisis. In 2018, 1 year after his successful diagnosis, Aaron started on enzyme replacement therapy, which is the only treatment known for hypophosphatasia. Aaron also had 9 more surgeries to undo damage that had already been done to his body. But since starting the enzyme replacement treatments, Aaron's bones have stopped decaying, and calcium deposits in other parts of his body have disappeared completely. As for his Crohn's disease, which actually had nothing to do with his bone condition, that is in remission. But to this day, Aaron still does deal with small levels of pain every single day. Aaron successfully finished his master's degree and started a family with his wife. Currently, he works as a data and analytics consultant for a hospital system and is a prominent patient advocate for hypophosphatasia.
A new police officer named Derek was dumped by his longtime girlfriend. This breakup caught him by surprise because he had actually just recently moved to Colorado in order to be closer to his girlfriend. So naturally, he was devastated. After a few weeks of being so depressed and kind of just moping around and going through the motions in his life at this point, one of his very close friends suggested to him, like, hey man, look, why don't you just make a profile on Tinder, the online dating service, and just put yourself out there again. You have no idea who's out there. Clearly, your ex-girlfriend was not the one. Derek had met his ex-girlfriend in a bar, and every other girlfriend he had ever had, he had met in person. So online dating was definitely not on his radar. But he was so lonely and sad, he figured, you know what? I got nothing to lose. And so he made himself a Tinder profile. Derek quickly matched with a woman on Tinder named Leah that he said was way out of his league, but he wasn't complaining. They chatted for a couple of weeks and they got on great. And so they wanted to get together and actually meet each other in person. But Leah lived well over an hour away from Derek. So there wasn't a natural meeting place. And they're going back and forth about where they want to go. And finally, Leah just says, hey, why don't you just come to my town? There's this great park that I go running in all the time, and they have this awesome field that's on a slope, and you can lay on it and look up through the trees and you can see the stars. And so that would be a cool thing to do on our first date, go stargazing together. So the date night finally came, and Derek was really excited. He was nervous too, because even though they talked on the phone, this is the first time they're gonna see each other. And so the plan was he was gonna drive out to her town and actually pick her up from her work. She worked at a hair salon, and from there they would make their way over to this park. And so Derek pulls up to the hair salon right as Leah is coming outside, and she's all excited and she's waving to him. She runs over and she gets in the car and they hug and kiss on the cheek. And it's like they knew each other, but they didn't know each other because their entire relationship was online or, via texting or a phone call. And so it's like they had history, but they didn't. But either way, Derek was really happy, and it seemed like Leah was too. From the hair salon, it was a pretty short drive to this access road that was going to bring them into this park. And when Leah told him to make this turn, it didn't look like a very well marked trail or even a marked park. It looked like this kind of random access road that Derek would not have associated with a big public park, but he doesn't know the area, and so he turns and he starts heading down this road, and the road went from cement to dirt pretty quickly, and this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, did I take a wrong turn? Does she know like where she's going? This does not feel like the way you drive into a big park, the way she was describing. Finally, they land back on cement, and they're actually on this road that's right up against this huge field. And so right away, Derek's stress is gone because now it's confirmed in his mind that, okay, that's a weird way to get into this park, but here's this huge, amazing field, and we're back on a real road, and everything's good again. Derek asked Leia, where should I park? Because they're on this really narrow road, and there didn't appear to be a parking lot. There also didn't appear to be anybody else on this field or on this road. It's this huge, open, beautiful space, but it did not look well populated or like it was well traveled. But she said, just go right up there. There's a small lot you can pull into. And so Derek starts going up this road, and he sees maybe 300 feet ahead of him are dim headlights of another car making their way down the road towards him. And now it was dark enough that he couldn't really make out what kind of vehicle it was. And so he didn't know if it was going to be some big truck or something like that. And so what he did is he just pulled over as far to the side of the road as he could to allow this vehicle to pass, even though there was a fair amount of distance they would need to cover before they were passing him. He figured just give them the right of the road. And so as they start moving forward, you can see that it's actually this big van, and they're moving pretty slowly, and he's just kind of waiting for them to pass, and he's not thinking anything of this. He's thinking that this is just another person at the park. And this van, instead of passing him, actually turns at the last second and almost goes bumper to bumper with Derek's car. He doesn't crash into it, but he stops just in front of Derek's car. And so Derek is a cop. He's a brand new cop, and he's super aggressive. He really believes in his training. And so as soon as this guy stopped in front of him and blocked the path for him, red flags are going up for Derek, and he knows something's wrong with this van. And instinctively, he says, Leah, stay here. He grabs his flashlight that he kept right in the center console, and he jumped out of the car and went right to the driver's side door of this van to confront this guy. And when he got up to the driver's side door, it was this really big guy who looked pretty startled to see Derek come charging up to him with his flashlight. And Derek's like, what are you doing, man? What are you blocking me in for? And the guy's like, oh, hey, sorry, I'm the caretaker here of this whole property, and we've had an issue with poachers in the area, and I was concerned you guys were poachers. It doesn't look like you're poachers, though. And Derek's like, no, we're not poachers. We're going stargazing. I'm on my first date here. And the caretaker's like, I am so sorry. Please get back in your car, go and enjoy your night. And at that, he backed up, did a 3-point turn, and drove right back up that road where he came from and disappeared down on the other side of the hill. Derek stood in front of his car for a couple of minutes, making sure this guy was gone. And then he turned around and he got back in the car, and he kind of joked with Leah. And he's like, yeah, he thought we were poachers. I guess you look like a poacher to him, and that's why he stopped us. But when he looked over at Leah to react to his hilarious joke, she wasn't paying attention to him. She was just furiously typing away on her phone, which Derek did think was a little bit odd. You'd think that she'd be more interested in this strange thing that just happened. Some weird guy just blocked us in, and I'm confronting him. You'd think she'd be interested in that on some level. She might want to know what I said to the guy and what he said to me, but she didn't seem to care. She was just really invested in whoever she was typing on her phone. And so Derek thinks, whatever, and just throws the car back in drive and continues up the trail the way they were going before they were stopped. So Derek continues down the road just a little ways until he sees a little dirt lot that's butted up against this huge field they're going to be hanging out on for the night. And so he pulls into the lot, backs into his space, and he and Leah get out, and they put a blanket out right next to the car, but on the grass on the hill. And they get their food out and their wine out, and they sit down, and very quickly they start swapping stories, and they're laughing, and they're stargazing, and they're having some wine, and everything's really great. After about an hour, it's totally dark outside, and Derek is laying on the hill facing back towards his car and towards the road they were on, and he notices to his left, up at the top of the hill, so the same area where the van had come from originally and where it went back to after they spoke that one time, Derek is looking out there, and he sees headlights, and it's the van. And now the van is driving down the road, not leisurely like it was before, but they are flying down the hill. And before Derek or Leah have a chance to react to this van barreling down on them, it comes flying into the parking lot and practically hits his car and comes to a stop where it's boxed his car in. So even if he got in his car, he couldn't drive away. And so Derek jumps up, Leah jumps up, and the guy, the caretaker, the nice caretaker he talked to before, he hops out of the driver's seat and he walks around the front of the van. He's got this pipe in his hand, and he looks at Derek and he's like, give me your keys and your wallet. And again, Derek is this brand new cop. He's 21 years old. He's not about to let this guy push him around. And so he doesn't do anything at first. He doesn't know what he's going to do, but he doesn't do anything at first. He just looks at this guy and he shows him that I'm not just going to fall over because he told me to. But then Derek is given a huge curveball when Leah, his date, stands up and runs over to this guy and stands next to him and turns around and looks at Derek and goes, come on, give us your keys and wallet. And Derek's like, great, I'm getting set up by my date who I've spent the past 2 hours with, I had a connection with this girl. And so now Derek is just standing there doing nothing, not to be tough, but because he's in shock. He feels so betrayed by Leah, and he just feels like, how could this have happened? And in that moment, Leah walks to the back of the van, and she gets a metal pipe. She comes back around, and she goes, Derek, give us your keys and your wallet. We don't want to have to hurt you. And this is when Derek looks at them both, and he goes, no. And as soon as he said that, the big guy tackles him. He gets thrown to the ground, but Derek could handle himself, and very quickly he was able to get up, and he drew his concealed carry pistol, and he's aiming it at the big guy and then back at Leah, and he's like, yeah, I'm a cop. Go ahead and put your hands up now. As soon as they saw the gun, they both dropped their pipes and put their hands up. And so as he's holding them both at gunpoint, and he's looking over at Leah like, really? You did this to me? Are you kidding me right now? As he's doing that, he has to get his cell phone out of his pocket, type in 911, and then called dispatch and had to say who he was, what his badge number was, what happened, and where he is. And where he is was difficult to describe. And so as he's trying to explain these directions, and he's saying, yo, yep, go left at the light, and then there's a gas station there, you're gonna go up this field, you're gonna see me, I got these two people at gunpoint. As he's doing that, Leah and the caretaker look at each other, and they just turn around and bolt. They figure he's distracted, we can at least get behind the van and run into the forest before he's going to catch us. And so instinctively, he takes off running after them, and he chases them for about 30 seconds into the tree line before he starts hearing gunshots. And they weren't his, someone's shooting at him, and he sees the muzzle flash out in the middle of the forest, and he's like, yeah, I'm not doing this. He turns around, runs back to his vehicle, he starts it up, and he has to basically smash into the van, back into the fence over and over again, like Austin Powers, like a 25-point turn, before he was barely able to grind his way out and peel out of this park. And so Derek pulls into the nearest gas station. He calls up dispatch and he says, hey, I just called 911 like 5-10 minutes ago, and I dropped the call because I was chasing somebody. Here's my name, here's my badge number. I'm now at this gas station. Can you send a couple of police officers over to my location now? And they said, yep, we'll send some to you. And so a police cruiser shows up with 2 officers inside that Derek recognized. They were senior to him, and they got out, and he explained again what happened, and they kind of gave him a hard time for getting catfished on his very first date, but at the same time, they knew it could have gone really badly. And so they decide they're going to load up in the police cruiser together, all 3 of them, and drive back up to the park. And so they get up to the park, and Derek points ahead, and he goes, that's the van, it's still here. And so they drive up and they stop short of the van. And the 2 uniformed officers, they turn to Derek and they're like, just stay in here. We're going to go check this van out. And so Derek's sitting in the car watching these guys go up to the vehicle, guns drawn. They're looking all around. They're clearing behind the vehicle. They're looking in the wood line. There's nobody there. And at some point he sees them put their pistols away and they go in the van. They're kind of shining with their flashlights all around. They're looking in the back, looking in the front. And then after a few minutes, they walk back to the cruiser. And as soon as they got in, Derek could tell there was just something off about how they were acting. When they were down at the gas station, they were kind of joking around with him. Now, whatever they had seen in the van was definitely not something they were going to joke about. And they turned to him and they're like, the back of the van, it was just knives and saws and pistols and rifles and lighter fluid and chains and handcuffs and duct tape. It was just awful, and it looks like there might even be blood on the ground. The 2 officers immediately called in additional backup, and before long, it was a full-fledged circus around this van of a crime scene investigation unit and other police officers, spotlights set up, and they went out looking in the woods for these people, but they never found the guy, they never found the girl, and Derek would tell the other investigators, hey, she works at this hair salon, like right down the road, I picked her up there. And so they went over to the hair salon and they wound up talking to the people there and they said, we've never heard of Leah. And when they showed them a picture of Leah, they were like, we've never seen her before. And so they came back and they told Derek, look, she's a con artist. And this whole thing, your whole relationship with her has been her setting you up in some way, shape, or form. The entire thing. That's all it ever was. And so for Derek, that was crushing. And he swore off Tinder immediately. He did not want to do any more online dating. But what really haunts him more than just being taken advantage of is, what would have happened if I wasn't concealed carrying? Would I have wound up in the back of that van? In the summer of 2019, a grandmother named Barbara was looking after her grandkids for the weekend while her daughter and her husband were out of town. Her daughter had 3 kids, 2 that were under the age of 6 and 1 who was 15 years old, and her name was Alyssa. And so anytime Barbara was looking after her grandkids for longer than just a single day, like if she was taking care of them overnight, she would just stay at their house so as not to disrupt their lives more than she needed to. And so their house was a modest single-story home in a nice suburb of Dallas, Texas, where the crime rate is basically 0 and everybody in the neighborhood knows each other. And so this particular night that she's over there looking after them was like any other. She put the 2 young ones to bed first, and then she and Alyssa stayed up a little bit later in the kitchen chatting, talking about school, before ultimately both of them went to bed. So because their house is a single-story home, all the bedrooms are on the only floor of the house. And so Barbara and Alyssa's room were right next to each other, looking out to the side of the property. And so as soon as Barbara got in her room, she opened up the window that was right next to her bed, because as a kid, she always slept with the window open. And even though her daughter's house had air conditioning, she preferred to keep the window open. So window's open, she has a screen that's in her window, and Barbara crawls into bed and she falls asleep. At about 3 a.m., Barbara wakes up to the sound of rustling coming from outside of her window. And so she hears it, but it sounds an awful lot like it's probably just a dog or a cat or some other animal that's in the area. It did not seem like a big deal to her, and she was just going to forget about it. But then she heard it again, and it sounded much more like footsteps, and they sounded heavy enough that it probably couldn't be a dog or a cat. And so she rolled over onto her elbows and she pulled the curtain aside just enough to look out the screen door. And so the moon was out, so there was pretty good illumination, and so she could clearly see the side of the house. She could see the side of the house, she could see the fence that separated their property and their neighbors, and then she could see the neighbor's house and all their lights are off. And she noticed propped up against the fence on their side of the fence, so on their property, was this bike that she didn't recognize. And she's looking at it thinking, is that Alyssa's bike? It's too big to be either of the 6-year-old's bikes. Whose bike is that? And as she's looking at the bike, she hears more rustling coming from the left, which is closer to Alyssa's room. Barbara presses her face up against the screen to try to look out the window towards the left, because whatever's making the sound is now out of her view. And as she's got her face pressed up against the screen trying to look, she sees a boy emerge from the bushes from right underneath Alyssa's room. He's got that high school Letterman jacket, like the classic, football jacket that high school kids wear. He comes out of the bushes wearing that, and he's got his hood pulled up, and he doesn't look over at her. He's just backing up away from Alyssa's room, and he's looking up into Alyssa's room. And so Barbara immediately thinks, okay, this guy is probably one of Alyssa's friends, maybe a boyfriend, I don't know, and Alyssa must have invited him over. Maybe she invited him when she knew her parents were going to be out of town, but before I said I was going to be here to look after them, and that message didn't get passed to him, and so he's here. All these scenarios are going through Barbara's head, but all she knew is she's not going to call the cops on some teenage kid that's coming to say hi to Alyssa. Instead, she's going to confront him, because Barbara was actually a high school teacher and had been for decades. And so she'd had lots of run-ins with badly behaved teenagers, and she was pretty good at standing her ground and being firm and kind of getting teenagers to listen to her. So she figured she would just go out there and be stern with him and he'd get the message. And so she quietly gets off of her bed. She walks out of her room to the front of the house. So he's over here, side of the house. She's going to the front of the house. She flips on the lights as soon as she's outside, and she quickly walks around to the edge of the porch where she can poke her head over and see right down the side of the house where this kid's going to be. So she pokes her head over and she goes, "Can I help you?" And this kid turns and looks at her for the first time, and immediately Barbara's like, oh, whoa, he is not a teenager. He looks like he's in his 20s, if not 30s. No matter what, he is a lot older than Alyssa. And it caught her so off guard, she didn't really know how to react to it. She was just looking at this guy who looks so much older, but he's got a bike and he's wearing a Letterman jacket. And so Barbara's a little bit confused. And so she's thinking to herself, okay, it's possible that he could just be one of those kids that looks a lot older than he really is. But somewhere in the back of her mind, she's thinking, this doesn't feel right. This feels like a grown man is trying to get into the house. And so as she's thinking about this, she's also registering that this guy, he seems completely unfazed. He's just looking up at her, and he actually starts taking steps towards her to the point where Barbara says, stop where you are. And he does, and he looks up at her and he says, I'm looking for Alyssa, is she home? And so as Barbara is just glaring at this guy, hoping that will be enough to get him to leave, but he's not leaving, it occurs to her that this could be a misunderstanding. And so thinking on her feet, she says to him, who did you say you're looking for? Lisa? Without any hesitation, he goes, no, I'm looking for Alyssa McCarran. She lives here. Barbara went silent for a second because he was right. That was her name, and she certainly was here. But she did not want him coming anywhere near the house until she had a chance to talk to Alyssa and confirm that she had invited him here, or at the very minimum, that she knew who he was. And so Barbara says to the guy, I need you to stay right there. It's 3 a.m. I don't know you. Give me a minute. I'll be right back. And he appears to get the message. And so Barbara went back inside the house. She shut and locked the door behind her. And then she went into Alyssa's room and she shook her foot to wake her up. And so Alyssa kind of sits up and she's looking around and she's like, what's going on? And Barbara looks at her and she's kind of annoyed with how the night's gone. And at this point, she's kind of blaming Alyssa for probably having invited this strange creep over to their house in the middle of the night. And she says to Alyssa, did you invite a boy here tonight? And Alyssa's like, no, what are you talking about? Barbara narrowed her eyes and she said, Well, there's a boy outside that clearly knows you. He asked for you by name, and he knows you live here, and he's outside right now. Can you please go out there and tell him that coming over unannounced at 3 a.m. is not very polite, and he shouldn't do it again? Alyssa's confused, and she's looking at her grandmother like, what are you talking about? And so she leans back and she opens the curtain of her window and she looks outside, and immediately she pulls her head back in and she says, Grandma, he asked for me by name? And Barbara's like, yeah, he said Alyssa McCarran lives here. And Alyssa's like, we have to call 911. I've never seen him before in my life. Suddenly, everything made sense for Barbara. This was a stranger. This is not a friend. This is probably a grown man, and he was probably trying to break into Alyssa's room. And so as she's having this realization, they both hear footsteps out on the front porch. And at this, Barbara goes into full protective grandmother mode, and she tells Alyssa, stay in your bed, do not move. And Barbara runs out of her room. She goes into her bedroom, and she shuts that window and locks it, and then runs to the front of the house to make sure that door was locked, because she thought she locked it when she came in, but she wasn't 100% sure. She gets right in front of it, and she can see that it's locked. And now she's standing right on the other side of the door, kind of waiting to see what's going to happen. And this guy is standing on the porch, but obscured. She can't see him because he's on the other side of the door. And it's silent for a second. And as she's standing there just waiting for something to happen, she hears knocking on the door. And it startled her when she heard it, and she yelled out, there's no Alyssa McCarran here. You have the wrong house. You need to leave or I'm calling the police. And the knocking stops for a second, and he says, I know Alyssa lives here. Tell her to come outside. He goes back to knocking, and Barbara picks up her phone and she calls 911, and she intentionally talks really loudly into the phone, making it very obvious she is calling the police. And very clearly this guy picked up on what Barbara was doing, because the knocking stopped and she saw him through the little slit of glass next to the door run to the left of the house, back towards the side where his bike was. And so Barbara, while on the phone, runs into the bedroom where she was sleeping, and she looks out the side window, and the last she sees of this guy is riding his bike across the street. And then he stops next to an SUV, and he opens a trunk and he throws the bike in the trunk, and he gets in the passenger side of the car and they drive off, which means whatever he had planned to do with Alyssa or whatever he was doing this night, he had an accomplice. The police show up a couple minutes later, and at this point, this creep and whoever he was with are long gone, but Barbara still gives her description of the vehicle and description of the night and what happened. And the police told her that over the past couple of weeks, they've gotten very similar reports from other households where there are young girls inside of the house. Apparently, this boy was actually a grown man that would use social media to figure out where kids lived, and then he would dress up like a teenager, and then he would go stalk them. And so whatever Alyssa had listed online, he had been able to deduce that she lived there, and who knows how long he had been looking in the window at her at night. In 2018, an up-and-coming Instagram influencer named Wendy was contacted by a hotel in Miami, Florida that wanted to see if she'd be willing to stay at their property over Memorial Day weekend. They said they were willing to cover all of her expenses as long as she was willing to post a couple of times while she was at the hotel, showing off how great the hotel was. They also told her to bring along a female friend, and that friend, they would cover all of her expenses as well. Even though Wendy didn't know if she had any girl friends that would want to do this with her, she was so eager to take them up on this opportunity because she was trying to make being an influencer be her full-time job. And so opportunities like this were huge for her. And so she said yes, even before she knew if she could bring along a friend like they asked her to. And so sure enough, over the next couple of days, as she reached out to her network to see if there's any females that wanted to come with her, everybody was either busy or wasn't that interested, or they had plans. And so since she did not want to cancel, she thought, well, it can't be that big of a deal if I bring along a male friend. And so she reached out to her good friend Mitch, who's this 6'4" athletic guy who was just one of her close friends. And she said, hey, would you mind coming along with me to this thing in Miami over Memorial Day weekend? I need someone to go with me. They asked for a female, but you're going to have to do. And so Mitch agreed to do it. And Wendy thought to herself, well, worst case scenario is they're not willing to pay for Mitch's, expenses, and that she would pay for them. And she told Mitch as much. And so they thought that was just fine. They figured that was a good solution. And so the day arrives and Wendy and Mitch are really excited about this trip. They don't often get to go travel around as influencers. And so they hop on a plane, they fly first class to Miami. When they get there, they go down, they get their bags at a baggage claim, and then they go out to the curb. And right away, Wendy sees there's this really well-dressed guy with dark sunglasses on, and he's holding up a sign that has her last name on it and the logo of the hotel on it. And so she waves to him and walks over, and Mitch is following right behind. And this guy looks at her and he says, okay, well, where's your friend? And that's when she says, oh, well, actually, I brought Mitch because none of my girlfriends wanted to go. So I brought Mitch along. And so this guy lowers his sunglasses and he looks at Mitch and he kind of looks up and down. Then he puts his sunglasses back and he turns and he walks towards this beautiful black SUV that's parked right up against the curb. And so Wendy and Mitch follow him, and this guy opens up the back door and Wendy and Mitch get in. The guy takes their luggage and puts it in the back of the vehicle and shuts it. And as soon as Wendy and Mitch sit inside of this car, the driver is visibly upset. He's kind of ranting and raving, and the front passenger window was down. And so Wendy and Mitch assumed he must be yelling at someone outside of the vehicle, like this guy that had just picked them up. He must be communicating with him somehow. He can't possibly be yelling at us. We just got here. We don't know him. But sure enough, as they kind of are tuning into what he's saying, he has a very thick accent, and he's saying, where is the other girl? You're not supposed to have a guy. It's two girls, not one girl, one guy. It's two girls. Where is the other girl? As Wendy is hearing this, she feels so uncomfortable, not just for herself, but for Mitch too, because she asked him to come along and had said, oh, it won't be a big deal. They won't mind. But clearly they do mind. And so Wendy's trying to explain to the driver that, I know you asked for a female friend, but I didn't have a female friend. And so I brought him along. I will pay for him. I'm not asking you guys to pay for him. I'll pay for everything that he touches. I'll pay for his hotel, his flight, everything. But the driver didn't seem that upset about who was paying for Mitch. His frustration came from a place of being frustrated, like they weren't going to be able to do whatever they had planned to do because now Mitch is in the mix. And so as Wendy and the driver are kind of going back and forth and the driver's getting more and more frustrated, the guy that had originally greeted Wendy and Mitch hopped in the front seat, and he and the driver started arguing with each other in Portuguese. And so for about a minute, Wendy and Mitch are looking at each other like, what is going on here? And these guys are yelling at each other, and then they stop, and the driver turns around again, and one more time he says to Wendy, where is the other girl? And Wendy says, there is no other girl. It is Mitch and I. That is it. At this point, the driver makes a sound like he was disgusted with both of them, and he raises his hand up like this, and he turns to face the road in front of him. And the guy that had originally greeted Wendy and Mitch, he gets out of the passenger seat, goes around to the back, opens the back of the truck, takes their luggage out, throws it onto the curb, goes to the door that is closest to Mitch, opens it up, and he tells them to get out. And so Wendy and Mitch climb back out onto the curb. The guy shuts the door behind them. He hops back in the front seat, and that car peels away. That was it. At this point, Wendy's thinking to herself, I bet those two guys have nothing to do with the hotel and the people that I had been communicating with to set this whole thing up. I bet they are just the drivers, and they were told to pick up two girls, and we showed up with a girl and a guy, and it screwed them up, and they got mad, and they got really mad, I guess, and then they left. And so I bet if I can just get in touch with the people at the hotel, the people I had spoken to, that they can clear this whole thing up. And so she opens up her email and she sends a message to Marissa, who was one of the people at the hotel that she had been going back and forth with when she was buying her plane ticket. And then she sent another message to the Instagram account that had over 10,000 followers that she had been going back and forth with quite a bit, that had actually originally reached out to her. And so for a couple of minutes, Wendy is watching her phone, waiting for a response. And at some point, Mitch says to her, by the time we get a response to either your, Instagram DM or your email, we probably could have just taken an Uber over to the hotel and spoken to them directly. So why don't we just go do that? And so they agree, they hop in an Uber and they drive the short distance to this hotel. And as soon as they get out, Wendy notices something that at the time did not seem like a big deal, which was the logo of the hotel, the one in real life right in front of her, it was a little bit different than the one that is on the Instagram page, the one she'd been talking back and forth with. That was their profile picture. It's different than the one in real life. And so that stood out to her just because she had looked at that page a number of times. But it was definitely the same hotel, and so she didn't think much of it. And she and Mitch walked inside right up to the front desk, and Wendy asked to speak with a manager. And shortly thereafter, a manager comes out, and she asks Wendy and Mitch to come into her office. They go inside and she says, okay guys, what's going on? What do you need? And so Wendy explains the framework of the deal she had negotiated with Marissa. And she said, look, when I got to the airport, the guys that picked us up were incredibly rude and they wouldn't give us a ride here. And I just want to let you know what happened. We don't care. We got a ride here, but we just figured you should know. And the woman looks at her kind of puzzled and she says, who was the person you talked to? You said Marissa? And Wendy's like, yeah, Marissa. She's the marketing person here. And the manager looks at her and she says, no, I'm the marketing person and my name's Kelly. I think you're at the wrong hotel, because we don't have any influencers that are here right now, and I would have known about this. Wendy can't believe it, and she pulls up the Instagram page she's been talking to, and she shows it to the manager. And the manager takes it, and she's pretty surprised by what she's looking at, and she's like, this is our old account. We deleted this, or I thought we deleted this. We have a new one because we rebranded. We have a brand new logo, everything's new, and we just felt like we'd start fresh. So I don't know who owns this account now, but that is our account. It's just, we don't use it anymore. I don't know how anyone got a hold of it. At this point, it clicked for Wendy that this whole thing was a facade, that this whole time she was being conned, and what really scared her is, to what end? What were they trying to do with her? Had she shown up with the other female friend, what would they have done with her? But at this moment, Wendy just feels totally overwhelmed by the entire moment. She's so embarrassed that she thought this was real, and she dragged Mitch along, and this whole thing was just fake. She's so embarrassed that she just approached this manager who basically said, that's all fake. And so she just wanted to leave. And so she stands up and she says, I'm really sorry for wasting your time, to the manager, and she and Mitch leave. She goes outside and she just sits down and she's crying. And Mitch says, hey, you really ought to call the police and let them know this happened, because, clearly there were plans for you and, had you brought a female friend, and they can't have been good plans. I think you need to let the police know that this scam exists. And so Wendy does call the police and she explains what happened. And she's surprised when they say, hey, where are you right now? We'd love to send a detective over to you to talk to you a little bit more about what happened. And so Wendy tells them where they are, and she's a little bit surprised that they want to send a detective over to talk about this, because in her mind, this isn't that big of a deal. I mean, it's a big deal to her and to Mitch, but nothing really happened. But either way, they go sit on the bench right outside the hotel, and they wait for the detective to show up. And just a couple of minutes later, he does. He walks up, he introduces himself, and he says, hey, let's go inside and grab a table and we can chat. And so they go inside and they sit down, and Wendy and Mitch go over their story one more time. And after they're done, the detective says, look, I don't mean to scare you, but I do want you to understand just how serious of a situation you guys were just in. So in Miami, human traffickers use these phony hotel Instagram accounts to attract young women like yourself to Miami in order to be trafficked. And so they will buy these old business Instagram accounts from companies that have either rebranded or who are going out of business. They'll pay top dollar to acquire those Instagram accounts. And then they will use them in order to get people like you to come to Miami. And so probably the only reason they didn't follow through on their operation is because you brought Mitch along, who posed a threat to them. And so that's why they were upset with you, and that's why they decided it wasn't worth it. So even though this must have been incredibly traumatic for you, I'm sure you were spared a much worse fate. So that's gonna do it, guys.